encourage your soul, enlighten your mind, and empower your faith. This is the Light Network. Conversations about life, Christianity, and culture. Welcome in. This is 4 preachers and a podcast, but there's only 3 of us. That's okay. We're charging you the same price. I'm Robert Hatfield, coming to you from Henderson, Tennessee. There is Brad McNutt, dapper in Moulton, Alabama today. What's going on, Brad?
I have finally read all the suggestions that say I need to grow up. And so I decided to wear a suit today, except I didn't put my jacket on. It's hanging on the door over here.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, let's describe his. Well, let's bring Chance into the conversation. Chance from North Charleston, South Carolina. Chance is all bundled up as though the sunny South Carolina is cold today. What is it in the
correct.
60s?
Well, last night we were under a freeze warning, and today is currently like 48. So it's really cold.
Bless y'all's heart.
Really cold for us.
I don't know how you're surviving. So, Chance, for our listening audience, they can't really benefit from the fact that Brad's so dressed up. How would we describe what Brad's wearing today? He's got a blue shirt.
Yeah, it's a light blue buttoned-up collared shirt. It looks like it has been recently ironed, maybe freshly pressed.
Mm-hmm. Dry cleaned, yes. Mm-hmm.
Yes, dry clean. Starch.
Pink tie.
Yeah, heavy starch, definitely.
Heavy starch. So it's stiff as a board.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but a pink tie with a... Yeah, it's got white stripes, and maybe that's navy. That's around like a navy stripe on both sides of the white stripe.
Yeah.
True
Perfect
fact,
dimple.
I bought this in Charleston, South Carolina at one of the Goodwill stores.
The tie?
Yes, Nautica. It was the Goodwill. We went to a Goodwill in a really nice part of
I remember
of
that.
town. You remember
Probably
this?
like Mount Pleasant or something.
Yes,
Yeah.
it was.
Mm-hmm.
So these are the kind of people who donate Armani suits and stuff. So,
oh, I love it. Hiram Kemp is still on assignment, and so he says he's going to join us on the next episode. We'll see what happens.
He's hanging out with Uncle Bud.
That's right. He and Uncle Bud, Mama Kemp are having an extended Thanksgiving meal.
Indeed.
And
where the green beans are fresh.
That's right.
And the Snickers have not been crushed.
This is great. Well, we're grateful that you all are with us today. This is season 2, episode 9. And we're talking about creating culture. A little bit different take today. We're going to discuss bridging the generational gaps, particularly in the context of our congregations, right, in our churches. Older people and younger people. We could talk about a variety of ways that we could divide or segment one another, and there are pertinent conversations around each of those. We could talk about divisions by economic status or racial divisions, things like that are certainly, permeant in our congregations, and barriers that have to be overcome. We could argue, there were similar barriers in New Testament times. Jew and Gentile, slave or free, we're all one in Christ Jesus. I mean, those passages are in there for a reason. But I think the thing that we're seeing a lot in our day and age has to do with generational divides. And, this is the design of the Lord's church. You've got old Christians and young Christians. You've got old people who have been Christians for small amounts of time. You may have relatively speaking, then younger people who have been Christians for longer than some of the older people in the congregation. So anyway, the point is we all need each other. Older people have things that are valuable to contribute to younger people and vice versa. So that's kind of what we're going to get into as we go through this. Chance, with any given congregation, you may have, a multiplicity of generations within that church, right?
Yeah, so I was, you said we were going to talk about bridging the generational gap as we were getting ready for this episode over the last couple of days. And so I started exploring generations and thinking about it. And I guess potentially you could have as many as 6 generations. Probably more likely most congregations are made up of 5. We might still have a few in our congregations who are from the greatest generation, and that's like born before 1928. But those numbers would be greatly dwindling. But then you have the silent generation from like 1928 to 1945, baby boomers from like 46 to 64, Generation X, 65 to 80, millennials, that's us, from 81 to 96, and then Generation Z, 97 and onward. So probably most of our congregations that we're going to be involved in and working with, we've got 5 different segments of generations that we're trying to bring together and have to live in harmony and unity and peace with each other. And so all of the different generations have different things that have made a major impact on them in their development and the way that they see things, the way they process things, the way they desire to go about things. And so it can make for some tricky and conflicting and tension as these generations blend together in how they perceive the work of the church and the church functioning together.
Life has changed a little in the last 100 years. I mean, you think about people who were born in the 20s, or to your point, I mean, 30s, 40s, 50s. It's a vastly different experience for those of us who were born in the late 80s. It's wild. I think that there is, in general, this mindset that, older people are more stable than younger people, more mature. I think if we're broad brushing it, that's probably accurate. But I would just like to level the playing field a little bit as we begin, and I'd like to use 2 Old Testament people to do that. Old people can do boneheaded things, and young people can do boneheaded things. In 1 Kings 11, it says in verse 4 that when Solomon was old, okay, that establishes the point. His wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. And so Solomon went after other gods, Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. And Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord. And this leads the Lord, in his anger, verse 9 of 1 Kings 11, to explain to Solomon that, the kingdom's going to suffer as a result of this, including, his successor, his son Rehoboam, which is what happens when you come down to chapter 12. Okay, so in chapter 11, we have Solomon who, turned away from God in his old age. Now we've got Rehoboam, relatively speaking, younger man. Solomon dies. He's buried with his fathers, the text says. Rehoboam comes in, reigns in his place. He goes to the people. The people come to him, rather, and they say, hey, listen, your dad made our burden really heavy, 1 Kings 12, verse 4. Lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke on us, and we'll serve you. And Rehoboam says, give me 3 days to think about this. So they do. He took counsel first with the old men, verse 6. And they said, if you'll be a servant to this people today, serve them. Speak good words to them. When you answer them, then they will be your servants forever. But he abandoned their counsel and instead went with the young men who had grown up with him. And he said, what do you think we ought to do? And they said, we think you ought to flex your muscles a little bit and let them know, just how powerful you are, which is what Rehoboam ended up doing. And, that leads us into the divided kingdom, right? So, old or young, anyone can turn from God. And I think Solomon and Rehoboam serve as an example of that. I'm not trying to throw anybody under the bus here on this episode. We're not saying that certain people are more valuable or have more to contribute than others. It's just sort of a level playing field. And I think old and young, we all need each other. No part of the body can look at another part of the body and say, I have no need of you. So that's sort of where
absolutely.
we're coming from. Go ahead.
Yeah, and it would be, it would not be correct to go to those two and look at the example of Rehoboam and conclude you should always listen to the older men and always reject the counsel of the young. Like, that's not the point. On that occasion, yes, the aged had the right counsel and the right wisdom, but there are occasions when the younger generation can have the better counsel or the better wisdom, and so it can be situational where you've got to listen and find the right counsel. And it can come from age, or it can come from a younger generation. But it is a great illustration that whether we're from an older generation or a younger generation, we need each other. We need each other's counsel and assistance and help, so that we're not led astray, and so that we don't make wrong decisions that are going to have, some lasting consequences for us or for others around us.
There's a lot of potential for church division within the generational gaps. And I think this is something, we really see it with racial division. Maybe we can really see it with an unwillingness to forgive or holding grudges. We could say, well, these are the things that have the potential for causing church splits. I don't know that we might necessarily see, maybe what I'm going to say isn't actually true, but I don't know that we see as much like, okay, well, this church split because the young people didn't like the old people. But I think there are a lot of issues that do cause cracks under the surface, and maybe even because I'm convinced, I'll put it this way, this is my opinion, that there are even some folks who become unfaithful, at least in part because of issues surrounding generational divides. I'm not saying, it's the old person or the young person's fault necessarily, but it's just the generations aren't working well together, and that creates this distance. Is that a fair statement? Would Brad, would you agree with that? You're giving me a nonverbal amen, I think.
No, well, look, here's the thing. I think it was C.S. Lewis who properly warned of the danger of generational arrogance. That is, each generation believes that they have corrected everything that the previous generation got wrong, and they have understood life the way it should be. And I think that's very much true. And you see that all of us have been in conversations where someone who is older complains about the younger, someone who is younger complains about the older.
Sure.
And most of the time they're filled with mischaracterizations, caricatures, straw men arguments. So, it's very real that there can be a divide that exists. And I may be jumping way too far ahead, but
it's good.
Who knows?
Well, ahead of what? We don't have a plan for this episode.
It's true. It's true. So, I think there is great benefit in having different groups in a congregation. You've got the youth group, the senior youth, the junior youth. Yeah. You've got your young adults. You've got, empty nesters. You've got the, some people call them owls groups, the older members or the prime timers or whatever you want to call them. Like, I think all of that is good. There is a danger that we need to be aware of when we do that, though, that we don't segment these groups off from each other. We are all one, and we need to find a way to get all of these groups together. Yes, it is good to be around people who are experiencing similar phases in life, but it is also good to be around people at different stages of life, both young and old. And so this is really in ways, a multi-layered and complex issue. It's not something that we can give simplified answers for. Yeah. Because many people will want to say, well, what we need to do is segment into groups. Some people say, no, we don't need to do that at all. Well, the answer is probably somewhere down the middle. Mm-hmm. So anyway, that's, I don't know what we're talking about other than bridging.
No, this is good. That is a fair and super great point. We even do this. Our children's classes are, for obvious reasons, often categorized by age or grade level in school or whatever. Right. But sometimes we end up even doing that among our adult classes as well. We'll have the senior adults class or whatever. And sometimes, the ladies like to go and to have a class of their own. And obviously there's nothing wrong with that either. And yet I think if our ladies are only ever in a ladies class, Sundays and Wednesdays, for example, then we're also missing something there across a potential gender divide. So, we just need to benefit from each other's experiences. I think there are a variety of reasons why bridging the generational gap for the purpose of glorifying God is challenging. And at the top of the list, and we've spoken to this, is that generational differences are real and they're deep. I had some college students ask me, a little bit ago, I'm trying to get help from older generations, but they're not willing to talk. And I said, well, here's the thing. They are willing to talk because I knew the people they were trying to talk to, but they express themselves differently than the way you do.
Right.
Mm-hmm. College students these days, I mean, they're very aware of their mental health, and because of that, they're willing to discuss a whole lot. We're not too many generations removed, in some cases just one or two, from people even questioning whether mental health was a real thing.
Yes.
So that is a huge leap in a relatively brief amount of time. But also, you talk about people from the greatest generation, or even, those in generations that follow who were drafted, in Vietnam and things like that. Those guys and some ladies went over there and saw things that they don't want to come back and rehearse, either because they want to protect the people who may hear it, or they just don't want to relive that stuff themselves. And, that's a different way of expressing themselves. They just don't talk about it. We have different experiences. We have different tastes. Which genre or which age of music is the best? Like everybody has an opinion on that, and it's probably in some way, laden with nostalgia. There's something about that there. Well, you know what? That bleeds over then into like the music of the church, for example. And, can we only sing songs that were written in the 1800s, or can we work in some Tillett S. Tedley every once in a while? But these are things that are generational differences that are real, and to just cast them off as though they're not, I think, would be a mistake.
That, and to mischaracterize each other and not understand.
That's right.
And impugn motives. Like older generations, for an example, people in our generation, very concerned about a number of issues that didn't necessarily seem to be primary issues in a previous generation or two. Doesn't mean that they were not concerned about them at all.
Yes.
Okay.
Right.
And so, honestly, and I'm sure we'll deal with this more and more, we've got to the biggest challenge, whether it's a generational gap, any other gap that exists, the biggest challenge is getting people to sit down in a room with each other and to talk to each other in an understanding way, not listening to someone to respond, but listening first to understand and then to be understood. Mm-hmm. That's the only way this thing changes, is to the degree that we are willing to sit and listen and understand that everybody has valuable experiences.
Yeah. And I guess a difficulty with these generational divides is we may use the same terminology, but use them completely different depending upon the generation and the generational influence. And so being able to sit down and listen and then ask questions to really pull the layers away and understand, okay, you're using the same words and the same terminology, but are we using them in the same way so that we come to an understanding that we can then work together and function together? And
sometimes the reverse is true. We talk the same conceptually, but we just use different words to communicate the same things. I have not personally heard a lot of people from my grandparents' generation speak very much about like loving Jesus or having a relationship with Jesus. That's just not like the vernacular that they use.
That's the key.
But they did love Jesus, and they talked about it just in different terms, and oftentimes not using that name Jesus, but maybe speaking of the Lord or Christ or something like that. So we're saying the same thing. We're just using different terms, and sometimes, Brad, back to your point, like people mischaracterize those people by saying, well, we never talked about relationships, or we never talked about loving God. Maybe you did more than, what you may think.
Exactly. It's like, And look, any student of history understands this. When you're reading a document or a speech or a pamphlet or something that was written in a certain generation, one of the first things you do, matter of fact, when you read it, one of the first things you'll realize is, okay, this is not modern in the sense that it didn't come off the press yesterday.
Yeah.
And you're going to look at it and go, okay, how are they using this? What we tend to intuitively understand that when we're interacting with an inanimate document.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes when we get to interacting with people, our personalities start clashing and we lose that ability to just kind of think, okay, what are they really saying here? How are they using this term? What experience are they drawing on? And one of the, well, I'll leave it there. That's that's one of the things we need to consider.
Is there an assumption by some, maybe even within, our fellowship in Churches of Christ, that modern scholarship is superior to, shall we just say, the great preachers of the past, for example? I guess, Brad, there was something you said that made me think, like, okay, sometimes if something was written in the 50s, 60s, or 70s, it's just like, I'm throwing that out automatically because it's just going to be all about the necessity of baptism, or something like that. And I'm like, I know, Brad, you and I have had these kind of conversations before, and it's like, well, those guys were saying the same thing. They may have stated it in different ways. Some of that was cultural, some of that was, we could even argue, the academia of their day. I don't know. I mean, would you say that I'm on a path that is real?
Yeah, I mean, the scholarly world is one that I am not just, super familiar with. Had some interactions with it. And I think one of the things to keep in mind is that each generation of scholarship is probably moving the needle in our understanding and study of things. Like, a lot of the fields are emerging. What are the things that we know? And
I think in a sense we would hope that it would be that way.
Yes.
Right?
And I think that a number of scholars will tell you, we're giving you our best guess here. I'm not stating this as the fact. I'm giving you the best guess I've got based on the information at hand. But yes, there can be that sense of, I mean, it would be crazy to deny that there isn't that sense of superiority sometimes. Oh, well, you didn't study at certain schools or certain levels, therefore your word should not be trusted above theirs. I mean,
one of the things I appreciate, Brad, that you've done over the last 10 years on the book club is that you did this because you knew you needed the discipline yourself, but you forced yourself through the cycles to read not just the cutting edge stuff, but also the classic stuff. And, I think about works like that may be admittedly fundamental, like The Gospel Plan of Salvation by T.W. Brents.
Right.
And yet, man, that guy he said a lot in a little, right? I mean, every sentence was important. I don't know. I'm just because it's old and just because they were trying to address a specific need, contemporary and perhaps unique to their time, doesn't mean we ought to throw it away. I don't know. I think that's part of bridge building,
not.
Right?
And I think so. And I don't know none of the scholars with whom I've interacted have ever said disregard old books. As a matter of fact, many of the ones they're going to send you to are very old books,
and much older than the ones we're talking about right now.
Yes, we're talking like thousands of years old,
right.
or 1,500 years old. So it's yes, it can get there, and it shouldn't. And again, you get into as with anything, there are dangers on both sides if you go to your extremes. But that is a way of bridging the generational gap. McGarvey was a very studied man. And I'm not just intimately familiar with everything McGarvey ever said or wrote. Right. But I have a strong suspicion that were McGarvey alive today, with the evidence that we have for certain things, that he would change his judgment on it if he were alive today, or have a different judgment on it because of the advancement there. Some people want to take it and be like, well, McGarvey said it, and so therefore it cannot be wrong. Well, that's dangerous on many levels.
Yeah.
And I think that he would tell you, had he seen the evidence, I think I probably missed that one. And that's okay. And any legitimate scholar I know will tell you, I think this is right, but I'm also pretty certain that some of the things that I believe are wrong. Now, I obviously don't know that they're wrong at this current moment.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to be wrong, but experience tells me that I've been wrong in the past, and there's a likelihood that I'm wrong now.
Yeah.
And so there's not a dogmatism.
Good.
Yeah. What does it feel like to be wrong? Well, it feels right because you don't know it.
Exactly.
Feels good until, Quill and Priscilla come around and say, hey, I need to tell you something.
Exactly. It feels great until, Inside the Scholar Study every Tuesday morning at 9:30.
And the point is not that new is always going to force us to rework everything, or that it's going to strip us of, even down to our foundation, but that it's going to help take us further. I mean, to mature.
It's building.
Yeah.
Yes, it's building on. It's not disregarding at all.
Yeah.
It's standing on the shoulders of them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I wanted to bring that part into this as well. When we get down to, maybe more, not saying that scholarship and academia is not this, but more of a practical level, everyday people, I think the biggest challenge in bridge building is just because it requires us to be selfless. Yeah. I can't have this attitude of, well, I've been a member of this church since it opened its doors 75 years ago, and therefore I have a chip on my shoulder, or everyone needs to cater to me. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, I can't, I think that the temptation could be for some of us as millennials, we may have gotten kind of used to everybody talking about us. And
I'm so sick of people talking about us.
I am too.
On both sides.
All the research and, Pew and Barna and all, they're like, hey, if churches want to reach the next generation, here's what you have to do. And while we do want to reach the next generations and we're ready to pivot as needed to become all things to all men, it could be that younger generations themselves develop somewhat of an entitlement complex, saying, okay, well, if this church wants to grow, then they're going to cater to me. Mm-hmm. And mm-hmm. neither of those two extremes that I've just described are accurate.
Right.
So, where do we go from here? Maybe let's get into some practical things, and I've sort of got a segment of thought that I've been thinking about the potential that's here, sort of what the generations have to offer each other, and let's broad brush this and just divide into two groups. There may be 5 or 6 generations in a church, in a congregation, but let's just divide it older and younger, okay? And if you're listening or watching, you get to decide which of these groups you identify with the most. But I think that there is some potential that lies on both sides that could help to bridge the gap and to contribute toward the health of the other side. I've broken this down into 3 sections. I'll give them, and then we can whatever. The first one I thought of is the benefit of history. There is a perspective that older people can bring, sometimes biblical. For example, God is faithful. He always has been. He always will be. This is the Passover in Exodus 12. When your kids ask you, why do we do this? You tell them. This is the 12 stones by the side of the Jordan River in Joshua chapter 4. When your kids ask, what's that about? You're going to tell them. I think that there must be in our lives things that are similar, that are testaments to the faithfulness of God. Here's an example I gave in the pulpit recently. When our kids were born, you get the fancy wristbands that say you get to come back here. I'm the dad I get access to. And, when you get home from the hospital, you don't just take that off and throw it away. I mean, maybe people do. I stuck it someplace safe, and when I run across it, I'm reminded. You know, our youngest had some health difficulties at birth, and it just reminds me God got us through that. And in the moment, I wasn't sure what was going to happen or what, you know, but God was faithful. And to me, it's kind of like the 12 stones, you know, over there by the riverside or something. You know, older people have the benefit of this historical perspective that I think is important, that they can contribute. And the psalmist, you know, I've been young and now I'm old, and I've never seen the righteous forsaken nor his descendants begging for bread. Psalm 37:25. So anyway, I think the benefit of history is a benefit.
Yeah, and they
more.
have.
Do y'all want to kick in here?
Yep. Well, yeah, let me kick in here. Like they potentially, right, if they've been a member of the same congregation for from their time as part of the young generation, now they're part of the older generation. Like just even having a perspective of the history of God's people in that place,
right?
You know, is so helpful and beneficial to the younger generation to learn and to get that wisdom and history and experience from, and seeing what God has accomplished in that location across those years.
Mm-hmm.
And I would emphasize the importance of even the older generation writing some of these, preserving some of these things.
That's a good point.
So in one congregation, I knew if I wanted to know the history of something we were doing, there was someone I went to who could explain to me the backdrop of everything that had happened.
Yeah.
Why a program came into existence, why it was there, what was its intent. This is how it's morphed through the years. Here at Moulton, one of our elders has written a book and just published on his own. It's been distributed to us as members, and I mean, it's available to anybody who wants it, but it's just his reflections on the history of the church here, the people of the church here. We're approaching our 200th anniversary.
Wow.
In 2026 will be 200 years. And, you know, and then there are a couple other people here that they offer such a wealth of understanding of just everything that is going on here and understanding the relationships that have existed. How do we mend bridges that have been broken? What about other congregations in the area? What's the history there? What do we need to do to resolve some of those issues if they exist? And so the benefit of history, you know, we tried that, but it didn't work. Not in the sense of, okay, therefore you shouldn't try it, but in the sense of we tried that and this is where we made mistakes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And who would not benefit if elders everywhere would not sit down and write out their thoughts about COVID? These are things we did well. These are things we did not do well. These were things that, you know, how do you handle which news source do you trust? A zillion things that could prove invaluable in time to come. And so that history is very essential.
I think that speaks to the second thing I thought of that older Christians can offer younger Christians, and that's the benefit of time. I know people, you know, people say I'm retired and I'm busier now than I ever have been. Well, I appreciate that or whatever. And I'm not trying to say you don't have things going on. But it does take time to do these things, Brad, that you've just mentioned from a practical perspective. And I think about what Paul says in Titus 2. You know, the older men are supposed to teach the younger men some things, and the older ladies are supposed to teach the younger ladies some things. And the only way that happens is with time. First, time invested to build a relationship. You know, if some guy comes up to me and says, I'm going to teach you how to be a man, but I don't know anything about him and he doesn't know anything about me, I'm not really going to be apt to listen to what he has to say. So there's got to be some kind of rapport there, some kind of relationship. That takes time. And then it just takes time to be someone who's available to people. And it requires some intentionality to that. And outside of sort of that doctrinal or instructional kind of component, I think about practically people who have been available to me, who have made time for me, and what that has meant to my life. I mean, that's been huge.
Yep.
So I think older people can offer younger people the benefit of time. Younger people need to make time and realize that time has to be made. I think older people, you know, have learned that lesson. But, you know, younger people, you got young kids, you know, whatever. it doesn't take any time for a week or 2 or 3 to pass, and you're trying to find out where you are in the midst of all of that. Older people oftentimes are in a season of life where maybe the rhythms have slowed down just a little bit, or at least you've learned to manage those better than the younger people are, and so you've got a benefit of availability.
Yeah, and I think that is understanding the importance on both sides of taking the time to sit down, and I think one of the great practices of ages past that it is certainly not popular. I'm not going to say it ceased to exist, but it's certainly not popular anymore, is the keeping of journals and diaries. And generations in the future can benefit from those thoughts, even if, we didn't get to sit down and spend time talking all the time. Those thoughts are still there. They're still stored, and people can peruse through them. And I think both sides understanding, as we've said, the benefit of time invested. There are people that are gone now that I wish if I could go back, I would ask for an afternoon of their time and take a notebook and a pen with me and ask question after question just to listen to them again. And so, that's it. We think we don't have time for it until we don't have the ability to make time for it anymore. And then you realize that was more valuable than I thought it was.
Yeah. To me, the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament reads like this journal, that Solomon is writing to his children. Yep. And he's like, son, listen, this is the advice I want to leave with you. This is what I want you to hold on to. And so, I think there's some benefit there. There's definitely, and as we've mentioned, it's hard, can be hard to make the time for that, but it's so vitally important. And so it comes down to seeing that and making it a priority on both sides. From the older generation and the younger generation to make this work. And I think maybe this is an area where we could potentially restructure some of the things in the way we go about some of our class times and our times together as a congregation, where we make an atmosphere where this can happen on the church grounds, like when the church is together to some extent. Every class doesn't have to be a lecture. There would be some benefit to pairing together different generations in a discussion type, smaller round table where you can spend some time benefiting from each other and wisdom and experience that has happened with that older generation.
Yeah. Well, see, that's probably a year or two ago, the elders were talking about having a parenting class, and they turned to me and asked me about teaching it. And I said, look,
I'm going to vote against that right now.
Yeah. I was like, look, you want me to do an introductory 1 or 2 things the Bible says, okay. But my ideal class is we bring people who are on the other side of raising their children in, and they talk to us about, these are things I thought we did well. These are things that didn't work so well. Are there scenarios that you have that you would like to talk through? How would you face this and that? I think there is, to what Chance is saying, having a class like that, there are tremendous benefits in my mind, and that will help tie those generations together where you're not. And, I think sometimes older generations do it when they offer advice, and some of us in this younger generation, a busy season of life, we have this tendency to shrug it off. They're like, hey, slow down. You don't have to conquer the world. Yeah. And you want to say, yeah, but I got stuff to do. And what they're slowly trying to remind you is there's coming a point when you won't be able to do this anymore. And this is not all there is. And you need to understand that. And so there are even those little moments in passing that sometimes we have a tendency to kind of roll our eyes and disregard, where they're trying to tap us on the shoulder and say, hey, keep your perspective. And even just paying attention to those moments, I think is important.
The third thing I had on my little list was, and we've sort of spoken to this, but it's the benefit of stability. I guess, Brad, just what you and Chance were just saying. I mean, they're there to say, listen, I know you want to freak out, but this is gonna work out. It's okay. And I even thought, like, older people can tell younger people how to be faithful when life is hard.
Yep.
To say this is going to be okay without minimizing the difficulty that the younger person is feeling. To say, you know what, when I was your age, I ran around like a chicken with a head cut off too in this situation, or I felt like my life was chaos like you do, but it's not. It's okay, or at the very least to say this is normal or this is common to all people without degrading, what's going on.
And I think that I'm going to be honest with I'm only 37. Some people that's old, to a lot of people that's still young. So
You're the oldest one of this bunch.
I'm telling
I hear
you.
that.
Probably like months. But anyway, the older I get, the more I don't know always, what my goals were when I first got into preaching. But I'm going to be honest with you. At 37, my goal now is to just make it to the end and not monumentally blow it. Like that's my goal. And I have like just the highest amount of respect for anybody who lives a life of faithfulness and they're just stable and they make it to the end. Like you start to see people that you've known that have fallen and, the things that have happened. And I have come to respect people probably more than anybody who have just been stable. Not they made these great quote contributions to things, or they were game changers or industry changers, but just day in, day out knew how to do the grind and were faithful beginning to end. So I think there's tremendous value in that.
It's not flashy. It's not exciting. It's not the thing that gets millions of YouTube views or Instagram follows, but that's really where the bread and butter of life actually is. So switching gears, what younger Christians can offer older Christians. And I had a list of 3. And this first one I debated if I should put this on here as like something younger Christians can offer. But I put the benefit of discipling, the benefit of being a mentee to someone else's mentor. And I do think that is a benefit. A lot of younger people, at least younger people with their heads screwed on right, realize that they are inept at certain things or that they need that guidance. And that opens the door for the older Christians to do what God requires of them to do in Titus 2 and parallel passages. And there's something to teachability. I think I referenced a minute ago, Aquila and Priscilla taking Apollos aside. Well, I don't know who was the older or the younger in that situation, but I know this: Apollos was willing to listen and he was teachable. And a disciple is going to have to be someone who's willing to learn something. We've spoken already in this episode to the importance of humility, in any generation, because any of us could trip up. I do think that it's a benefit that younger people have or can cultivate, that I need some guidance. And, we see the wisdom in the design of the church that guidance is provided from a variety of perspectives.
Yes. And I think I would say just this about discipling or mentoring or being a mentee. Don't be afraid to ask. I don't know many people who, if they are asked, wouldn't jump at the opportunity. So from my experience, this is what happens. The younger people are afraid to ask some of the older people because they view them. I mean, think about it through preaching lens. Like, oh, I'd love to have a conversation with that guy, but there's no way he'd take any time from me. That's what you're thinking.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the older
I'm crazy. What do you do?
Yeah. And then the older you get, you realize, oh, well, he's a normal person and actually a very kind and generous person and has poured into my life. I wish I would have just had the guts to go talk to him when I was younger. And then the younger generation don't be afraid of that. But to the older generation, there's that line. You don't want to be the overbearing person who wants to tell people how to live without the relationship and all those things. But sometimes you inserting and taking an interest and just kind of with wisdom gauging whether they are open to it can really be helpful. Because a lot of times I think there's fear on both sides, and we're both just looking at each other going, I want to help you. Well, I need you to help me. But everybody's staying quiet.
Right.
And instead of getting the help they need.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is an area where, that older generation and older Christians whose energy levels are down. And so they can't do some of the things that they did before. And so they can tend to start feeling like they don't have a place or they don't have a purpose. They don't have anything to do. But this is an area where they can thrive if as a younger generation, we're willing to say, can you help disciple me? Can you help mentor me? And it gives them a place of belonging and a purpose, and fulfills what God really wants them to accomplish in that stage of life.
I think a second benefit younger Christians can offer older Christians is the benefit of energy. Just being a workforce. Sometimes that energy looks like, having creative energy to think of doing, things in new ways. I feel the need to caveat that we're not, repurposing rewriting the gospel or anything. It's not that that's anything new. Hopefully you understand that if you listen to this podcast. But, it is finding ways to reach people in this day and time, just like all the generations before us have sought to do. But there's also just the benefit of energy in terms of just manpower, getting it done, doing the things. And that doesn't relegate just the younger people to the workforce and give the older people a pass. But, again, broad brush speaking, maybe they can help to accomplish a lot of the goals that both generations have on both sides, or that is a collaboration, the collaborative goals of the entire group. So I think the benefit of energy is there. And
sometimes you can get apathetic. Like you look at something and you say, the older you get, it hasn't changed in my life. That's just the way it's going to be.
Yeah.
And you see a younger person come along with a desire and drive to change that. And it can reignite in you to say, okay, maybe this can be done.
Yeah.
I've let something go dormant. And so that energy is contagious that they can bring to us.
And then third, I put the benefit of open-mindedness. And, again, this is something the older generations, broad brush, again, like to look at younger generations and say, well, they're too open-minded. Their brains are going to fall out because they're so open-minded. But on the other side of that, I mean, I think about, a creativity, a willingness to listen to arguments and to discern truth, almost like test the spirits to see whether they are of God, 1 John 4:1. Just a thoughtfulness, a renewed thoughtfulness is sort of what I'm getting at, that will position us congregationally to be all things to all men, that we might by all means save some. I guess that's what I'm thinking about there. So let's get practical in our waning moments and talk about not just the potential that's there, but how we can accomplish this. There have been some things along the way. Man, what you guys have said of everything from journaling to, thinking about maybe Bible class opportunities and how that can help to bridge the gaps. There have been other things that are stated. I think that those are super helpful. If we want to be someone who bridges the generational gap, to be a bridge builder, where do we start? It's been mentioned a minute ago. Chance, I know you were thinking about this too. Just listening with a view toward understanding each other. It seems like a good place to start, right?
Yeah, I think so. And maybe we think sometimes on a, how do we fix this on a congregational level? But really, it begins with a personal level. Like, what can I do is what it's going to start with me. Like, can I listen to someone from another generation? Can I be willing to make that connection? Just let me be the first one to reach out and build a connection with someone in a different generation and start building a relationship, and then allow that to grow into what it might influence in the lives of others too.
Yep.
But it's listening, it's as we talked about earlier, listening and being willing to ask questions and dig for understanding, and not having a preconception or a prejudgment about that other generation, being willing to tear through some of those barriers and ask some questions to come to a real understanding of each other, so you can move forward and help each other, right? That's the goal, right? That we would receive one another, Romans 15:7, that we would do, not about pleasing ourselves, but about pleasing our neighbor for their good, for their edification, Romans 15:4, right? We have the same hope in each generation. Our hope is Jesus and the gospel. And so it's receiving each other where we are and helping each other grow in our Christian faith, grow in our trust, grow in our confidence, and building each other up. And so each generation has something to contribute to that. And it's a willingness to say, you might have something that will benefit me. Let me hear your experience.
That's going to help us to just meet people where they are. If we're listening to them, then we can figure out, where we are, what our goals are, the aspirations, how we're going to accomplish the will of God in our lifetime, and how we're going to utilize everybody's talents toward that end. There's a reason why, like Colossians 3, verse 12, is in the Bible. Put on, as God's chosen ones, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, patience, bearing with one another. If somebody's got a complaint against another, forgiving each other as the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive. And above all these, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. I mean, these are exhortations written to the church, for the church. I mean, this is going to help to bridge whatever may divide us in a lot of ways. I think, the golden rule goes a long way in this. Consider how you want to be treated. How would you respond if someone came at you the way that you're thinking about, going towards someone else? And consider what is the best way to actually genuinely touch another person's heart, to speak to them. And again, we're just meeting people where they are, which all starts with listening to the other person.
I was just thinking about, it's kind of peculiar in preaching. I don't guess I ever realized it. In preaching, part of our task is interacting with multiplicity of ages. Every generation that exists in the church, we're interacting with them. But, if I'm just sitting back and being honest, and I were not preaching, I were a member in a local congregation, would I have a tendency to stay more in my age group? Probably so.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's a fair assessment.
Yeah, it's comfortable, I think.
Yeah.
And we are a people who like comfort and ease. And so it's easy to adapt into, these are the kind of people I'm around all the time. So let's kind of just stay around them.
Exactly. So what Chan said, start with yourself. Okay. I'm not saying don't enjoy time with your people group. Just say, one Sunday every month, or 2 Sundays every month, before services, we're going to get there early. Chances are a number of older people will be there early. And you know what? I'm going to sit down on the pew next to a person and just talk to them. Just start building the bridge. And what we're having to remember too is some of the people that we might be interacting with, widows, widowers, they may have gone days without any human contact or discussion. And so just start there building the bridge. But I will tell you here, the thing that has helped us more than anything is, and this was something Brooke wanted. Brooke is very passionate about. She's over it. She has very big on how it's implemented, and that's Lads to Leaders. Lads to Leaders is more than most people look at. It's a youth program. No, understood correctly, Lads to Leaders is a congregational program. It's a multi-generational thing. And so one night, the providers were out and some of the men of the congregation were teaching them about plumbing and some of those things. Listen, it's amazing to watch how Mr. Jack Spillers at church, who was on a speech coaching team, and his relationship with my oldest son, Drew, just giving him advice, checking on him, seeing how he's doing, building those bridges. We have seen benefits of that, of making sure that not just the parents of the kids are involved, but even those who are, we would consider to be grandparents and great grandparents ages, being involved. And now, when teenagers walk by, they're not ignoring the older people and the older people aren't ignoring them. They're interacting with each other because they know each other. And if it took some plumbing discussion to start that, well, let's go buy a store. Build
let's
the
go
bridge.
to Ace Hardware together.
Hey, man. We can start having services in there. I mean,
it is important. So listen to others. And then I'll just kick out a second thing I've got. If I want to bridge the generational gap, I got to be worth listening to. I need to be someone who recognizes that you have to earn people's trust and earn the right to speak into their lives. I know as Christians, we are our brother's keepers. And so, from a brotherly standpoint, brother to brother or brother to sister in Christ, or even sister to brother in Christ, there may be, an obligation that we have. But the implication is always that there's some relationship undergirding that. And the ability to influence others is something that has to be earned. So, an older person can't just say, well, I've made it to 65 and now I can say whatever I want to whomever I want. Nobody likes that. Don't do that. And the younger person can't say, well, I'm 25 and carefree and I don't care what anybody thinks of me. I'm just going to say whatever I want. No, nobody likes that either. You have to earn the right to speak into someone else's lives.
And I think Solomon is very clear in Proverbs that's foolish behavior.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, a fool, he vents his thoughts or something to that effect. A fool basically says everything that's on his mind. Without
and I think you're right, Robert, to highlight that can be true on either side of this divide, right, of generations. So.
So we got to be worth listening to. Hey, Timothy, don't let anybody despise your youth. Okay, so what do I do? Well, you be an example to the believers in speech, conduct, love, spirit, all of that, faith. You just make sure that you are living a life that is worthy of imitating. And isn't that basically the Titus 2 thing as well? You can't give it if you don't have it. So older people are teaching younger people thus and so. You're just living a life that is worthy of imitation, and in that way, by interacting with each other, you're building trust and helping each other out. I think getting involved. Brad, you spoke to this a minute ago. A willingness to engage another person, whether they are older or younger than you are, to ask for advice, to visit each other, to eat together, to get to know each other, to just encourage each other, just an interaction that has the end goal of just merely encouraging someone else. That is a worthy goal. It's okay to be that person. People like those people. Hebrews 10, let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works. So, be that person, get involved.
And you never, so Miss Donna Dutton here at church, she got a number of the young girls involved with our local nursing home, taking them. And, the first time they go, they're all nervous and, what is, I don't know what to think really. And then it's now of they're asking her, hey, when can we go back? Or when we have our monthly nursing home service, they're the one going to the room to get them, to push them, in their wheelchair to the service that day. And, just asking questions about who they are, how they're doing, understanding who they are. And that's not even within the church. That's just people in the community that they meet in the nursing home.
Wow.
But it is bridging a generational divide. And it's kind of like anything. I don't think anybody intentionally wants to exclude or harm anyone, but you do have to be intentional if you want to build bridges. And a little intention, both personally and congregationally, I think will go a long way in this area.
Yeah, definitely. Intentionality is at the heart of this, right? We can just say as a congregation, hey, we're struggling with our generations working together and that we need to do better. But if that's all we say, we're not going to make any accomplishments, right? We're going to have to, with intention, say, okay, what can we put in place? What plan can we start to work that's going to help bridge these? We can just say, yes, this is a problem and it needs to be better. But until we get intentional about fixing it, then it's going to remain.
Yeah. All right. The last thing I had on my list, and you guys can add whatever else you want to this, but I think we got to keep in mind that the goal is to help everybody and each other to be like Jesus, not like us. So, I've had youth group age young people, come to me. This was years ago, and they were like, "Does being a Christian mean I have to be exactly like this person or that person or the other person?" And I was like, "Well, what do you mean by that?" And they said, "Well, I mean, like, our interests have to be exactly the same. Like, is that gonna rob me of my own personality and uniqueness? Is that what's required to be a Christian?" And I said, "Well, no. I mean, who gave you what's unique to you? That's to be used and stewarded in a way that glorifies God. There obviously will be some unity there." But that's when it struck me, like, there are some people who legitimately think that when we talk about things like restoring New Testament Christianity or whatever, that in their minds, whether they state this or not, their assumption is we're talking about, doing church the way that American Christianity looked like in the 60s or something. And once again, we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater on that. Everything they did wasn't wrong. There's some merit there. But does it have to look exactly like that? Well, it can't. It's 2023. There's going to be some differences. So where do we end up with this? Okay, that in all things we may grow up into him who is the head, even Christ. Ephesians 4:15 and 16. And it goes on to say, when everybody is participating, when every joint and every piece does what it's supposed to do, it contributes toward the growth of the body, and all of that is in Jesus. And so the goal is to be like Jesus and to help other people be like him, and not just to try and help them be more like us. That's that selflessness that I think is at the heart of the challenge of bridge building, but that also becomes the goal of bridge building itself, to help us bridge these generational gaps.
Yeah, and why, I've thought about this quite a bit. Some people, when they are mentoring others, you can tell they're simply trying to reproduce themselves. They're trying to replicate themselves. And my first thought is, do you want someone to be like you? I want someone to be far better than me. Like, the goal is way higher. Like, have you seen Jesus? And to people who want to replicate themselves, there are two questions I want to ask them. Number one, have you seen Jesus? And number two, have you ever really seen yourself?
Right.
I mean, because the best amongst us, we're a constant mess and struggle. Whether it's publicly known or it's just the strivings of fighting temptation and other things. Why would I want you to be just like me?
Yep.
I want you to be better than me. And Jesus is the prime example of it all.
Well, and turn that argument a little bit, and you'll see a similar point. I know people who are hesitant to involve themselves in someone else's life because they think, well, I'm nobody to imitate. Okay, well, that's good. I mean, that's the point. You are the exact type person that we need involving in someone else's life.
Who recognizes Jesus is the heart of all of this.
Yeah, that's right.
Yep.
So. Final thoughts? Anything you want to add before we land the plane here?
I mean, I'll just say God's design is for multicultural, a multi-generational church where we're functioning together for His glory. And so that's our goal. Like, what are we going to be able to do in our generation with what we have in the congregation where we are to help these generations work together for God's glory? And we want to do that to the best of our ability and let that continue, because our being in the presence of God in eternity is going to be multicultural, multi-generational. So, we're working on that now.
Yeah.
And I would also encourage not to, when people sometimes are looking, maybe they've moved into an area and they're looking for a congregation to attend. I understand the sentiment that a lot of parents express. I want somewhere where my kids have a lot of people their age, and I understand that. But I will speak to you from a kid who did not have that. I grew up, the church where Dad preached, and most of my formative years was a restart. 12 members to start out. 5 of them were our family. And you know what? You learn to build relationships with the kids that were your age, the few there were. You learn to build relationships with people your parents' age. You learn to build relationships with people your grandparents' age. Are there benefits to having other kids your age? Sure. Are there benefits to not having other kids your age? Yes.
Yeah.
So don't treat one like it's a magic bullet over the other, because we could just be insulating them sometimes from some great blessings that are involved. And so think your kids don't just need people in their age group. Yeah. They need people of all age groups to help form them. And I need them and you need them. And so it's just something we need to keep in the forefront of our minds.
Good point. Well, as usual, the clock is against us, and we can't say everything, that we'd like to say to make it a completely comprehensive idea. But if there's been something here, this has benefited me a lot. And if there's been something here that's benefited to you, then our mission is accomplished. Maybe you've got thoughts, feedback, questions, comments, future episodes, ideas, you know what to do. Mail, MAIL at thelightnetwork.tv is how you can get in touch with us. We are 4 preachers in a podcast, even though today we're just 3. Hiram is still around. He hasn't quit the show. We're hearing your mail, revolting against the podcast. Hiram's still around. He just
I'm sorry, we can't produce the tweetable quotes that Hiram
we can't. We're not him.
Uncle Bud and crushed Snickers and expired green beans. It's just not natural to us.
Nobody can do it. Nobody can do it. So
when he comes back, we will sit in silence for an episode and just let him.
That's he owes us a whole episode. He really does. Any messages you want to send to Hiram directly? MAIL at thelightnetwork.tv. We'll forward them just to him. That'll be great.
Actually, send those to MALE at the Light Network. Be sure to capitalize the M.
Of course. We are 4 Preachers in a Podcast. You can find us on your favorite podcast app at 4 Preachers in a Podcast, or on YouTube, or on our website, thelightnetwork.tv. And we'll be here every Friday. That's what we're doing. A few more episodes left in season 2. Hope you'll be with us. Until then, stay cool.